So part two, picking up with quasi-experimental designs. I say here no randomization, and what I mean there is that that's not a requirement of the design. So this is what we mean when we separate people by um, an intrinsic trait, like in one group I'm going to have all the students from Massachusetts, and from one group I'm going to have all the students from New Hampshire, and I'm going to measure something by those groups. That's a fine thing to do, but that means it's not experimental because people are not randomly assigned. They often use the example of, measuring the differences between the men and women in your groups. That's a quasi-experimental design. It's not random. Pre-experimental is would encompass things like case studies where you have just, even one person and you are describing the change that happened through the course of treatment. So all of these are fine, but what I think the book is really pointing out is that quasi-experimental and especially pre-experimental designs are really open to threats to their validity. Why is that? Because randomization is really the key. All of these three types of research are trying to uncover causal relationships between variables. We're trying to figure out what happens when I do this thing to a group of people. What's the outcome? So it is a causal relationship that they're looking for, but what can creep in and what really hurts the validity is something called tertium quid, the third thing. You might remember from one of my previous videos I talked about the study that found that during times where there was a lot more crime, people were buying more ice cream. And so that's a classic example of tertium quid. The third thing that was really at play there was the heat. So that's a confounding variable that is more responsible for the causal relationship than either of the two variables that the researchers began with. But this can happen in much more subtle arrangements as well. So here's an example. A research proposal I had a hand in crafting with a group was about what would happen if we gamified MFT training. So we had this idea that we would make this really fun game, then we would use it in supervision with first-year MFT trainees. And we thought, oh, we could do an outcome study. We'll have one group that plays the game in the first year of their supervision and one group that doesn't, and we'll see, are the people who play the game, better at therapy? This is shorthand, but let's see what happens. Well, the problem is that it's really hard to randomize that study. Even days of the week that people go to practicum are not really randomly assigned. So the people that live closer to Keene are usually given the night of the week that is not the class night, so not the Tuesday night. And that's to try to make it easier for people who are coming from far away. So they're all on Tuesday. So that's a non-random assignment to practicum groups. Why does that matter? Tertium quid. The people who are living closer to Keene also typically get more client contact hours in their first semester or first 2 semesters because they're available. They're hanging around Keene, and so they make their available really wide and they catch more client hours. So the tertium quid in this example is we wouldn't really be able to make the argument that it was the game that was making the difference. It could have just been non-random effects by group, people getting more experience, or some other confounding variable that we couldn't even identify before the study. So that's why randomization is such a great tool if you can use it, because it really protects you from a lot of the threats to validity that Shepris and Young go over in experimental designs. I mean, almost every single one of these can be mitigated by randomization because it selects against selection, it protects against selection bias. And randomization also protects against extraneous variables because they are equally dispersed among all the groups. So if I could randomly assign first-year students to whatever practicum group, then people who are catching more client hours would be equally dispersed among the groups. The tertium quid would be shared. Let's go back to where I was. Yeah. So I mean, the point is that this is all about validity, and I guess my heart rate was sort of going up as I was reading these chapters because it seemed like, gosh, how does this relate to clinical practice? How does this relate to people who are not going into PhD programs? And I think the answer is that, hopefully we're all going to be in some way informed by research as we go out into full-time clinical practice. And as you are a consumer of these reports, I want you to be thinking about the threats to validity in experimental designs, because we're very much in a cultural moment that is valuing randomized clinical trials and other experimental designs. And I think we still need to be asking questions about whether or not the results are really useful and trustworthy. I'm importing that word from the qualitative world because I think it's important to think about it here too. So these are the lists of the threats to internal and external validity, starting on page 50 in the Shepris and Young book and going till about, 52? And I'm not going to go over each of them. I'm going to select the ones that I think are most pertinent. So maturation, I think, is actually a pretty important one because we know that people change over time, right? That's one of the things we believe as therapists. So you always have to ask yourself, is the change that the authors are describing in the study really due to the intervention, or is it just because time has passed? And that was actually a threat that was really present in the gamification example I just mentioned, is that first-year MFT trainees tend to get better because they're in school and they're learning about therapy and time is passing. It would be hard to construct an argument that said, it was the game. It had to be the game that made these people get better at their craft. Now, there are design choices that can mitigate that threat. So one of which is sort of staggering your intervention, a quasi-experimental design where I use all the practicum groups, but rather than just having one group that gets the gamification intervention, we do it a month apart in every group. And we are testing the students. This would be awful to live through, but testing the students at regular intervals so that hopefully the hope would be that we could plot their progress and we would be able to see these little spikes after the gamification in all the groups. So that would be one way to address the concern of maturation in a study like that. What was the other one that I wanted to talk about? Okay, and regression. I think this is really crucial too in our field because another thing that we know is that people tend to regress toward the mean, toward the average, both from up high and down low. So this is sort of disheartening as a couples therapist, but we know that typically couples will get a little bit better in therapy, no matter what. And that's due to the regression toward the mean. They're coming in at a really low level of satisfaction. And so typically they'll go up in their satisfaction scores, no matter if the therapy is like total crap or not. So it's important to read these studies with a grain of salt and saying, is the change that I see reported due to the intervention, or is it due to regression toward the mean? And when I get my chance to teach a little bit about statistics, we get like a hot minute to talk about statistics in a couple weeks. We'll talk more about how you can look for that sort of on the statistical math level. One more, hang on. One that over here on the external side that I want to highlight is the interference of prior treatment. This is huge in our field. If you have a sample, even if you have a sample that's nice and big, you know, over 30, that's the magic number, right? If a substantial number of your sample has had prior therapy, that's gonna present a threat to the validity, because what if the change that is happening now is actually attributable to the therapy they received last year, not to your special intervention that you're trying to test. That one comes up a lot, I think, in our field. So I urge you to look through pages 50 to 52 to sort of get a better handle on each and every one of these validity issues. But I guess just remember that try not to get bogged down in the specific designs and the specific models, because I think it makes a whole lot more sense, since most of us are going to be full-time clinicians after this class, to think about really critiquing research rather than just designing it. It also strikes me that I think this is true. This might be slightly wrong, but I think every group in our class is designing a qualitative study at this point. So our design concerns really live outside of this content area this week. So let's think about this specifically as working clinicians and how we can judge this stuff appropriately for our practice.